just focus on what you know and focus on the product and build a company. That's it. But all the startups that I've worked at that have been successful, they have this legacy software that's like so bad.
There's always like so much technical debt, right? You look at it and you're just like, as an engineer, it often makes you shut.
Vue allows you to put all your concerns in one file, right? So you have your CSS.
All right, so
Cool.
I mean, I just gotta say thanks for coming out here because it's been like a ridiculous drive, I know, for you too.
Yeah, 2 hours all the way from Yelm, Washington.
Yelm, Washington. All right, so today I'm super honored to have Phil Tadeo. Phil is a very talented front-end developer. I've been personally working with Phil on, I guess we had 2 shared clients, then we both became full-time W-2'd. We've worked on some personal projects together. We did some shared consulting together as well in the kind of web design space, and then other projects. Anyways, I think there's kind of a lot of value that we can talk about. Myself being more of a DevOps engineer, you working with the end user facing world. So I just kind of wanted to pick your brain and get some thoughts on lessons learned in the startup space. Both you and I have worked for quite a few smaller companies. And then even prior to you and I working together, you were also working for other startups as well.
Yeah.
So I think there's kind of been like, you've had an interesting career arc. Maybe do you want to add anything in kind of some of your experience, maybe frameworks you've worked with and what you've seen over the years?
I mean, I started off when jQuery was the must-have and everything, and then went through Angular, and then into React, and then into Vue, and then we are currently getting ready to move into Vue 3. It's just been really interesting seeing the web transition over. I was fortunate enough to see the mobile space really take off, and so you got to see a lot of like jQuery stuff, and I'm sorry, a lot of Ajaxy stuff take off, and the birth of the true SPA.
Yeah, the true SPA. So I mean, the single page application, I think it seems to work really well when you have a particularly focused product where you know the requirements really well, or you have a team that's large enough to support that. On the flip side, I think you and I have even observed this in our own personal project, that trying to be purists often is also a hindrance when you're maybe not resourced enough to do that.
Yeah.
Maybe just talk a little bit about like Fullstack versus SPA, and because I mean you support Fullstack as well. So like what do you see? When's the right point for a company to be like, oh, we're going to go single page application, APIs, because there's a lot of coordination that has to happen for that to actually be viable.
Yeah, well, I think lessons learned, probably the one thing that you have to consider is just what's available to you in terms of your talent. Like, what are they good at? If your talent is good at building full stack apps with like monorepos, then let's just stick to that and then move forward there. If you happen to have talent that can focus on back end and front end, and your SPA is where you want to go, then do that. Based on what we've been through personally, I feel like just focus on what you know and focus on the product and build a company. That's it from there. Because if we focus too much on technology, we become purists, and we want to do it right technologically. We want to make sure we have the right stack. We want to make sure that we're using the latest and greatest. But all the startups that I've worked at that have been successful, they have this legacy software that's like so bad.
There's always like so much technical debt, right? You look at it and you're just like, as an engineer, it often makes you shudder, and then you're like, but it's making money,
It is exactly.
It's working, and like you get this working product, and you can honestly see you're benefiting customers, you're solving real world problems, and companies doing that. So if you were to today, like just picking based on like what you know, what you've learned, you're going to build, Phil's great. Let's say you run a food breakfast joint, and you wanted to build an app for your employees. Yeah. Maybe take orders on the iPad or something like that. Sure. We were kind of just talking about some ideas in that space. Yeah. And like, where would you go? Like, how would you approach that?
Well, as far as the front end goes, I would definitely go with React Native, because React Native it's built on JavaScript, And React Native is really similar to just React. So anybody who knows that, knows how to do React, they can jump into React Native at a fairly low cost in terms of learning. And they can pick it up really fast. And not only that, but you can put it across multiple devices with relative ease. Yeah, I feel like that would probably be my front end choice. If I was going solo on it and working the back end too, I'd probably do some Node stuff. And,
like Express
yeah,
Server,
yeah.
Node.js.
Yeah, things like that. But definitely that. I wouldn't want to go native. Just, I mean, for me personally, it's a huge learning curve. I've decided to focus on full web technologies, and luckily there's been people out there who have written, you know, these abstract libraries that allow you to write JavaScript in these native apps. And in fact, I was playing with the Linux native app that it was in React Native, and it just worked.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, that's pretty slick.
Yeah, so I would definitely go that route, but that's because I personally know how to do that. But if you know, I'm sure that you being a Java guy, you would write it in Java or Kotlin, you know.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, I think it's an interesting set of things. In my experience, I've come to appreciate the Java as a designed language as opposed to a developed language. I think if I were to compare and contrast it against like PHP and even JavaScript in a lot of ways, like both of them are like really ugly languages, but they get the job done too. So like, I don't want to knock the language for not being useful because they actually are extremely useful. So I think if you're running a small business, you've got a startup, you're maybe fresh out of college or you just got some fresh funding and you're just trying to get the idea out the door, I think the main point that we're both communicating is pick what you know and run with it.
Yeah.
Get that initial customer validation as fast as you can.
Exactly.
And then once you have the revenue in there, circle back and start paying down the technical debt as it makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think that's like one like key lesson that both you and I have observed.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, maybe let's talk about like project management. What we've seen that doesn't work and what does work when you're working with, let's say like relatively small teams, like what we typically work with. Small teams, maybe top, let's say 10, 15 developers. If you were to design how you want that flow to work from product management, UI, UX, like what does that flow look like in your head? Like where are the mock-ups at? Where's the meat of the meetings? What's the purpose of the meetings? And when does development start?
Yeah. So it really depends on how big the company is and stuff. But I mean, if we're talking small, and we actually have the luxury of having a designer, then the designer and the front end guy would work together a lot. But in terms of meetings, so I think I found that weekly check-in meetings are actually really productive for a smaller team, and just talking about what you're going to do is actually really good. But not too much. Don't check in too much because that you kind of break the flow. You know, you break momentum. You don't want to do that. Probably gosh, I mean, what size are we talking about here in terms of team?
I'm just going to say it's a maximum size of 10. So why don't we start with
10.
like, okay, how about why don't we start with actually the very early startup stage? You have a founder, you got the idea guy, and then you have a developer. We'll start there. So just you have someone who's going to be the implementer, and then you have the founder who's kind of got this idea, and maybe ideally they have some customers lined up that they can beta test with. Yeah,
gotcha. Okay. Yeah, so I've actually worked in a very similar setup like that before, and you guys work very closely together, especially with the founder who's essentially guiding the product, and you have to let him know that yes, this is possible, or no, this is impossible, or we could do that, but it would take this much time and it would probably be the worst. So in those situations, I think we would probably meet more often, especially during the design phase. So almost every other day we would meet, and then once we refined it and looked at it from what the design guys were asking for, and then for what is actually possible from the front end team. Once we said, okay, this is possible, and then we start delivering it, and but as far as like
and at that stage you're full stack, right? Pretty much like your developers doing everything, front end, back end. It's all smushed together in whatever language they prefer.
Exactly.
Okay. So now let's say things are going pretty good for the business. They've actually got a lot of customer growth. You have kind of this pool of bugs, and you also have a laundry list of features that the customers want.
Yeah.
Maybe you've now brought on about like 3 or 4 devs, and things are starting to get a little bit hairy and complicated, and you're kind of dealing with the mess of the system. How do you, where do you start carving things out? Are you at the point where you're breaking up code in the front end and back end yet, or are you still just in grinding it out mode? Because what I've observed is being in grinded out mode for quite a while at this stage. You're definitely not like making the, oh, we're going to optimize this. It's no, we're just like, our hair's still on fire. We're still just trying to get things done. We're having Friday escalations. It's late night. People are stressed out. The money is running short. But we have to get these features out the door because otherwise, you know, we might all lose our jobs and the company's going to implode on itself. So like, where's the technical leadership, or is it just you're just trying to fight the fire and keep things going?
Personally, I've enjoyed the. So here are the features. So at that point, you're probably going to have some kind of task management system. I'm hoping GitHub. GitHub's pretty cool. One, it's free, but two, it helps you stay in the code, and so your requests are really thought out, and then from there. I think teams form organically around who's best at it, and it's still kind of a flat structure. With, of course, you have your main guys that are in charge, but as far as the developers go, it's just really the senior guys, who they are, and they kind of rally around it. And then from there, you would just start building. You just start building out the tasks. And as a front end and back end dev, if you decided to run with like Vue, for example, then that would actually be really simple to work in parallel, right? You hash out a contract between what the front end is going to receive from the back end, and then once you guys say, okay, here is the JSON object that you're going to receive, now you can build your front end, right? And then you start building the front end and based on this contract. And then you can work in parallel. And then in some cases, you can actually deliver one or the other before. Sometimes I deliver the front end product and we just hide it until the back end is ready, or
so
vice versa.
That's almost like a feature flag kind of thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so you could work in parallel with the devs, and then once they're actually ready to be wired in, you guys have a quick little meeting, and then in my experience, we find a few little bugs here and there, but other than that, it's ready to go. And working that way is probably the most efficient.
All right, let's talk a little bit, because I think there's a topic that we haven't addressed, and it's actually really important from a code cleanliness standpoint, kind of a developer happiness standpoint. Unit testing and integration testing. This is kind of like, as a developer, if you don't know it, it's a really weird concept to learn. It feels counterintuitive. It breaks all your current code. And it's there's a lot of overhead associated with it. But as a senior developer, you also know that without it, weird bugs creep in, and it definitely helps save things in the long run. So if you're starting up, let's again pick this. You're a senior developer. You're starting out your new project. Are you going to write unit tests at all, or are you going to just get this idea out the door?
Absolutely. No. Again, if your developers are skilled enough, unit tests are absolutely important, especially from a component standpoint. When you're building reusable components, these components have a contract that they have to their parent components, and when you write a test, it solidifies that contract. But another thing that it does is that it also allows you to know, it helps give you more visibility into whether you've written a good component and if it's actually reusable. And if you start writing tests and you realize like, oh man, this test is like way too complicated, then chances are the component is too complicated. And so you want to break it up, or you want to do it's single use principle essentially is what it is with the components. So
now let's talk about components. I feel like folks that aren't haven't worked, you and I obviously are talking the same terminology. I understand what you mean by components. But I don't think anyone who's listening to this is necessarily going to have the same vocabulary and the same previous experience of like writing something and having components written in the wrong way. So in React, a component means something. In Vue, a component may mean something different. Do you want to maybe describe like kind of at a visual level, like you've got like a layout, and then maybe you have some like actions that happen, handlers for like you click this thing, you touch the submit button. Where do you want to carve out like kind of where this is and where the API sits and the interactions between those? Yeah,
absolutely. So basically, React and Vue actually are very similar in terms of what the concept of a component is essentially the same. The syntax to write them is a little different, but basically a component is a node that you write, and then it's the building blocks of a UI. And so we like to use the atomic structure And so basically what that means is you have this thing called an atom, and that is a very basic component.
Is that a button?
It could be a button.
Okay, so it's like an HTML element. We can just call it a button.
Yeah. And
Okay.
so at this level, these components are mostly concerned with styling, although some of them might have some business logic in them and maintain some state in them. But for the most part, they're functional components.
So in the case of a button here, is that like you're saying like, okay, styling meaning it accepts some classes being thrown in there, and then it has some event handlers like an on submit, like an on click, like it exposes a handful of those that are then interacted with?
Yeah, well, you would generally just make it transparent, which means that you just bind all the listeners and all the attributes to the actual button component, so that whenever you import this button, it has everything, all the properties, all the events that you would expect from a button. So at this level, really, the more you're more interested in either you're more interested in the styling of it.
Okay.
Right. So if you look at
this is like the most granular. This is just a little piece of functionality.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So you get a handful of these. You've got your list elements that accepts items.
Yeah.
You've got a form that accepts a bunch of things.
Yeah. At that level,
now forms get complex though.
Oh yeah.
Because now you have state binding. You've got data binding, validation. I feel like in the web world, forms almost seem like the most complex element. It seems like.
Yeah. Well, the form has a bunch of things. One, it maintains the state of your data that is going to be submitted, but it also has to validate it, and it also has to visually be adhering to your design. So at a form level, that would be what we consider like an organism in this atomic structure, right? So
wait, let's run through. So we started with atoms. I'm totally jumping around
atom,
here. Okay,
right?
so we got an atom.
Yeah, and then you have what's called a molecule, and a molecule is generally you have 2 atoms or 3 atoms that build something. So if you were to picture like a search bar with a little search button, that would be a molecule.
Okay, so that has the atom of the label maybe on the left and maybe an icon.
Yeah.
And then like a little text input field and maybe a button on the right. Like is it 3 of those?
It's usually a little,
or just 2.
Yeah, it could be 2. It really depends, but generally speaking, they're just 2. There's just 2 atoms in there. Okay. Essentially is what it is. And then from there, so for example, like a form, like a control field would be a molecule, or it could be an atom. But like if you have the label like you pointed out, and you have an input field, then that could be considered a molecule, right? And then again, at that level, you're just bringing those 2 and maybe adding some styling to them. So at this level, you're still more focused on styling. Then you have your organisms, which bring together all these molecules and maybe some atoms.
No, the organisms actually like ours. Is that where like all your rich behavior is at? Handling that?
Yeah. They still.
Or is this just purely like a design concept, like a hierarchy of visual elements?
Both, right? So when you're dealing with components as a front end developer, you're dealing with logic, but you're also dealing with design. Which design is, if you think about it, the I/O to the person. To the user using it. So you're still going to be dealing with design no matter what. But at a organism level, the example of the form, now you have a full form, right? So if you have like a sign-in form, for example, that form's responsibility is to gather information from the user, and that information is the user ID or email and the password. And then not only that, but to also make sure that their email is formatted correctly, and that their password adheres to whatever validation standards you have for it. And then it also is responsible for emitting a structured form. Now, form data. So a lot of folks like to bind their AJAX calls directly to the form. I personally don't like to do that. I think that that should be done one level up. That should be the responsibility of the parent. Like you wouldn't, when you employ like an example, like an input component, its responsibility isn't to do something with that data. Its responsibility is just to tell you when it has that data. Okay. So it's kind of the same thing with the form.
This goes back to the testability thing.
Exactly.
Which is now you can, something that you and I worked on, like one of the things while I was doing some of the sprint work was putting together an API contract and be like, okay, here's the data shape. And what was kind of funny is like the approach that we took for that first round was, let's hash out a Google Drive doc and we'll just have a call together. And we'll talk about what information we're going to exchange. We just basically built out a handful of JSON objects. Okay, here's what a get looks like. We just called it, like it's just the heading get on this resource. And we just described, okay, what's the minimum components? And you kind of had the UI design up at the same time.
Yeah.
And we're kind of talking about like, what's the absolute minimum, what we can go in there. Because I think this is actually a really important concept, which is when you're working with back-end engineering and front-end engineering, it's much easier to add new fields down the road than it is to take them away, because you don't know later if something's being removed or if it's actually being used if you were to remove it later.
Yeah.
So you want to start with like a really small, as tight of an API as you can.
Yeah.
And then we built out kind of that JSON structure. And now tying back to your component thing, what I remember is when you were building that out, you literally had like, it's just like a JSON text or JSON objects in there. You push in there in the meantime, which is kind of like your fake data until the backend team actually has the API built out. Because the backend team is responsible for a whole bunch of other stuff, making sure like the database structure is correct, creating migrations, doing the backend validation, business rules, whatever else, right? They have their own set of problems to solve for. And then on the front end, you don't want to be held up by this team that might be stuck in a refactoring nightmare of like, oh, that's right, we've discovered all kinds of other headaches because of legacy decisions and data structures and stuff. And in order for both teams to meet up, you have to start with the end in mind, which is both the visual element as well as the data back and forth. Can you maybe talk a little bit about like some lessons learned in handling like input validation or just error handling on the API side? Because not every response is going to be an HTTP 200 OK. What's kind of the pattern that you've like seen the team kind of normalize around, and what's that evolved into?
Yeah, absolutely. So a one-to-one contract with the front end and the back end seems logical, and for the most part works very well. So what I mean by that is, you have the contract that you have with your back-end guys, and then now you go and you build your app to expect those properties, right? That has bitten me in the butt way too many times.
Okay, so like how? Because now you got me curious, because I mean, like most of the time it works really well. I feel like it works 90% of the time. What's this 10% of the time where it just goes ape?
Well, it's not just that. It's like if we decide that, okay, this key now is different, we're going to change it. That you've built components and you've built other things that go downstream that rely on that key to be this specific, key, all right? And so what I mean by that is that, so if one day we change it and then it just changes, every component breaks. And and that's a one-to-one relationship.
So you're talking like there's like a data marshaling layer between the API client and your component. You've kind of decided on, here's the visual terminology that I'm going to use. And then the data has a little bit of you're going to call it, I don't know, email on the API side, and maybe on your side it's called email address or username.
Sure,
right?
And at the beginning they could start the same, but there should be a layer that transforms API to the component, right?
Now, are you now on new things that you build, you're always including that layer? Or
so
do you start out and then be like, well, now things change, so now I'm going to introduce the layer and refactor it? Like what's your...
Yeah, so basically, what I do is I just start building these components, right? And by now we have a nice suite of components that we reuse everywhere. And so I assemble the form that I need, and then that form itself has data that it accepts and data that it outputs, and it's in its own shape. And there is a service layer that takes the response and it transforms it into that data. Into that shape, that same shape, and then and vice versa. So if I'm doing like a post, then it grabs that form data, transforms it into the API, right? And when we would do that normally, right? Like even in the back end, whenever you guys are calling, certain third-party APIs, you have to transform your data to shape whatever Google's version, or if you want to do searches for Bing and Google and whatnot, they're going to have different keys, so that you use transforms for their qualifiers and stuff. So it's the same deal here, same concept in the front end, in that you don't want to have every component have that one-to-one relationship. You want a layer where it's like, this is the one spot where everything maps.
Okay.
And that is definitely one of the biggest lessons I've learned, because that gives it, one, you could reuse that layer, right? You can hook in another API and then just transform over to your data. But two, if data shapes change, you don't have to reshape everything internally. You can just reshape it at the transformer level.
Okay, cool.
So yeah.
All right, so that's transformation of kind of your contract in the happy path.
Mm-hmm.
Error handling, is there like an error handling standard?
Oh, well, see, that's where it would be. Yeah, well, hopefully the front end and the back end agree on a shape, on a proper shape. But yeah, if there would, that exact same area would handle those errors. Ideally, if you have like your standard HTTP responses, like 400s and whatnot, that you can handle it appropriately, and you have a component that knows how to display those. Yeah, but other than that, yeah, the consistent error responses are very helpful, especially to the front end user, or especially to the user on the front end.
Yeah. Okay.
There's like, I've gotten 200s with errors.
No. Like, yeah. Right. Exactly. I mean, I know I saw that in the developer channel the other day. I forgot who was working on some third-party integration. I was just like, oh, that sucks. A successful as a 500. That's terrible. That's funny.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about like building, packaging, Webpack, Babel, blah, blah, blah. I mean, there's a lot of complexity in the front-end world compared to the jQuery days.
Oh, yeah.
And then there's even TypeScript now, so you have transpilation,
Yeah.
Let's talk about like maybe you're starting out again, like going back to our metaphor of maybe you're all in, you're a JavaScript guy, you're all in on that as a framework. What's your ideal stack right now, and what are the packaging things that someone needs to know how to use?
Well, if you're going full stack, I mean, if you're going just full in front end like SPA, and then you've got separate APIs, both. I mean, all these technologies come with CLI out of the bat now, so you don't even really have to set up like your own custom
Webpack.
Webpack.
A lot of the boilerplate decisions have been made for you.
Yeah, Vue's got its own CLI. React has its own CLI. React Native has its own CLI. So you just run out of the box.
Just kind of pick one and run with it.
Exactly.
How do you decide on what the right one is for?
Depends on the project I'm making. I mean,
let's maybe talk to like a non-technical person in this case here. How do they make a decision for their team? I want to move in this direction for X or Y reason. Like, are they just going to rate this based on GitHub stars, or like what's a metric that actually like lets someone know where the developer mind share is at?
Well, one, you have to pick a mature framework, right? Like something that's been there for a while, because it's going to have a lot of plugins, a lot of packages, dependencies that are there for it. So you can't go wrong. Vue 3 is kind of still new, but you can't go wrong with it. It's a really popular framework. React is definitely popular. That's where I would go. So whatever.
What was the Google one? I forgot. We played
Angular.
With Angular, that's right.
Yeah.
Angular's been around for a long time too.
They have, yeah. I'm surprised they're still
And I guess
around.
there's kind of a difference too, just in philosophy of Vue versus, and I almost want to put React and Angular in the same camp versus Vue. Vue is really focused on the view, ironically, and that's VUE as opposed to VIEW.
Yeah.
And then you pick your own HTTP library like Axios or something else like that, right? Whereas React and Angular especially seems to be more, it's almost like we are the full MVC type of like, it's the whole, you buy into an ecosystem. All the decisions are kind of made for you, and you really just fit into that pattern. And React is almost a little bit like that, because it's like if you go into React, then your storage default almost seems to be by like Redux once your application grows in complexity. And I guess then there's also MobX. That's a whole other category of it, like storage.
Yeah,
and
I mean,
stuff,
you still got third parties and stuff. I actually kind of feel the other way around. I feel like when you go into Vue 3 or Vue 2, sorry, it's a lot of syntactic sugar, and it's really nice, and it's really.
Where you're saying Vue packages the HTTP stuff altogether?
No, you could still bring in Axios. Same thing with React. You can bring
right.
in
No,
React,
I know you
Axios.
can. I just feel like it seems like the defaults are there's like certain packages that are definitely the recommended stack. Like in the Angular world, from what I remember, is like, oh, you have Angular forms, you have Angular, like it was like a ton of different elements. Here's Angular internationalization, like things like that back in the day. It felt almost like Zen framework type in the sense where it's like we're going to provide a comprehensive framework that does everything.
Yeah.
No,
they
view,
definitely
like
have
almost even
modeling.
what you were describing earlier with the component model, it's like almost making a lot of decisions. You have a ton of knobs to turn as an organization versus like boilerplate decisions are done for you.
Well, I mean, it really depends on what you're. So if you're just coming out of the box, then you have a lot more freedom. But if you're like on top of a legacy, for example, a legacy stack that you already have, you have to make it work with that. We use some dated stuff on our end, and we managed to put Vue 3 over it. But
it's been so long since I've looked at any of the front end stuff that it's like I feel like I'm definitely like out of the loop on like where the decisions and thought patterns have been. So you got me curious there. So in our world here where we're using Vue for the front end, what was the decision criteria for using Vue versus React? Because I remember there was some vigorous debate on the topic. It seemed like. Why did we settle on Vue?
Well, I actually wasn't there in phone burner land when we decided to go with Vue. I don't think it was a bad decision though, hindsight. So I'll tell you why though. Vue versus React. I feel like Vue is more friendlier when it comes to syntax.
Okay.
And it's closer to the actual like HTML stuff that folks are used to. There's still certain concepts like state management and lifecycle hooks and all that stuff that you have to learn, but it's not that difficult. Whereas the newer React stuff, they're really it's hook based, and it's really cool if you understand it. But it's essentially a la carte. So if you need it, you import it, and so you have to know how to do that. For anybody who's watching who wants to get into React in your Vue, there's really good articles out there that translate Vue to React or vice versa that really help you understand the concepts. But as far as React goes, they are definitely more vanilla-y style JavaScript. So if you're really comfortable with JavaScript and building on your logic like your loops and all that stuff and the templating, then React is your choice. But if you're more of a like, hey, I just want to get my hand held a little bit, and I want templating, that's more streamlined and whatnot, then Vue is the way to go. But personally, I feel like I'm a fan of React. I really enjoy working in React, especially when it's in TypeScript land. But with Vue, I think I can get applications out faster.
Oh, interesting.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
That is interesting because I feel like Vue or React provides a lot of boilerplate to make things easier, so you'd think it would go out faster. Is that just because of like the mental load of having to like switch your brain to a different context and way of thinking about things versus being like, oh, it's just an Axios library, hammer this out, wire it in, move on?
Yeah.
Like what is the difference?
Well, it depends on how far you go. So out of the box, Vue allows you to put all your concerns in one file, right? So you have your CSS, you have your templating, and then you have your actual logic, in one file. Whereas in React, you have to have your own CSS in its own file. Now you could put CSS in it, but with extra dependencies that will allow you to do that. But that would go in its own file, and then two, you would have to write, like I said, more